Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and tonight I'm joined by Helena, aka NoJusticeMTG. Great to have you on. How are you doing?
Yeah, not doing too bad. Can't really complain at all. Looking forward to the show, as always. Lots to cover this evening.
Fantastic. Yeah, lots of stories tonight. Coming up on tonight's show, The Guardian goes on strike, the latest from South Korea, and a Turner Prize winner dedicates her award to Palestine. Stay tuned for all of that. Our first story, though, is very much a developing one. The French government is at risk of collapse as its prime minister faces a vote of no confidence in France's National Assembly. The debate is still happening as we're speaking to you, but we should know the result fairly soon. And if this passes, the minority government of Emmanuel Macron's centrist party will become first, or the first, to be brought down by a no confidence vote since 1962. This doesn't happen very often. The vote has really been tabled to attack one man, the new Prime Minister, Michel Barnier, only appointed in September. The former Brexit negotiator for the EU sparked anger amongst opposition parties after he used executive powers to pass a contested budget earlier this week. That was without allowing MPs to vote on it. And that anger is so great that left-wing and right-wing parties have united to boot Barnier out of office. The left-wing alliance New Popular Front, as well as the right-wing National Rally, have both tabled no confidence motions, and each party has said they'll vote for whatever motion brings down the French Prime Minister. Some background: in a snap election in July, the left-wing New Popular Front won the most seats. They won 193. You can see them in red there. President Emmanuel Macron, though, refused all the party's nominees for Prime Minister, appointing Barnier from Les Républicains instead. So that's a centre-right party that didn't win many votes at all. Meanwhile, Marine Le Pen's right-wing National Rally got 142 votes. You can see that in dark blue there. Now, that gives the two blocs, the far left and the far right, more than enough votes to push the centrist Prime Minister out. And speaking before the debate today, Nathalie Oziol of presidential candidate Jean-Luc Mélenchon's left-wing France Unbowed, who are part of the New Popular Front, gave this background.
Today is the day Michel Barnier falls, he and his government, because he has no majority in the National Assembly to pass his austerity budget. And he has no majority because his party got 6% of the votes in the snap elections on July the 7th. The New Popular Front won these elections, but Emmanuel Macron refused to take into account this democratic result.
And what do you tell people who say, listen, this is going to create uncertainty and chaos for France?
Yes, this is the little music which, Macron's MPs like to entertain at the moment. But the political chaos, the economic chaos we are in is their responsibility. And I would even say it's the responsibility of the President of the Republic himself, because he has made decisions which go against the choice of the people in France. So when he decided to appoint Michel Barnier, he decided to ignore the result of the snap elections he provoked himself. It was his decision to have snap elections. So here we are 3 months later with a government on the brink of falling. And it was inevitable. And now the question is, what do we do? Well, with my party, we have always said the same thing. The government should be a government of the New Popular Front, because the people have decided so on July the 7th.
So that's what you're calling for. You're calling for a left-wing prime minister to be picked by Emmanuel Macron if Michel Barnier's government collapses?
Yes, first of all, because what else is there to do when people have voted? What else is there to do than respect what they have decided and what they have voted for? And the second thing is, now enough is enough. Emmanuel Macron has done enough damage to France. You said it, we are in a political, social, economic chaos. And it is his own responsibility. So now he must leave, whether by our impeachment or by his resignation.
So that was an MP from the left explaining why they would be voting against Michel Barnier. They're hoping that would then mean Macron would ask the left to form a government. Of course, though, it's not just the left who see some advantage in toppling Barnier, Marine Le Pen's right-wing national rally are also thought to be voting with it. And Le Pen, in the debate today, said this.
The National Rally Party will likely vote in favor of a no confidence in just a few minutes. But what is this surprise that we have from our prime minister, who is dogmatic, who has not allowed any type of concession, regardless of what it was? Ladies and gentlemen, Prime Minister, you have chosen to continue the liberal technocratic government that has mired this country since Emmanuel Macron took power in 2017. You talk about the verticality of decisions, the refusal to speak to us and to accept the will of the people in terms of migration, taxation, or European integration.
Now, up to now, it's the left who've been most open about their ultimate aim of toppling France's President Emmanuel Macron. The right, though, has been a little bit more circumspect, with Marine Le Pen dropping just one hint of her intentions on Monday. She said the Constitution provided 3 ways out of the current crisis. 2 of them, she said, were currently unviable. So they were a reshuffle or another dissolution of Parliament. Now, Parliament can't be dissolved because the Constitution means that there's a sort of time limit. And the reason it'd be difficult to have a new government formed is because neither the left or right blocs are likely to agree to a new prime minister from Macron's minority party. As I said, the French Constitution prevents presidents from dissolving Parliament again, or the president from dissolving Parliament again until 2025. That, Le Pen said, left just the third and final option, Macron's resignation. So where is Emmanuel Macron? Well, the answer is Saudi Arabia, though he is now reportedly on his way back to France. Responding to the threat that Michel Barnier would be ousted, Macron called it make-believe politics. Well, it could all become very real rather soon. The budget that triggered this explosion in French politics was aimed at cutting France's deficit. Barnier tried to push through reforms that he said would raise 20 billion euros through tax hikes while cutting 40 billion euros in government spending, mostly affecting welfare spending. Now it looks like France's economy might be hit even harder as the country risks entering the new year without a budget at all. I'm joined now by a friend of the show, Ollie Haynes, a journalist covering French politics. Ollie, we haven't had a result yet, have we? As the vote of no confidence, are we expecting a result soon?
Yeah, there should be one tonight. Le Monde reckons that it'll probably be within an hour from now. But currently everyone is still making the speeches defending the no confidence motion or arguing against the no confidence motion.
As far as I understand it, many more people have been defending the no confidence motion, right? It seems, are you fairly confident that the government will fall?
It seems like that's the most likely outcome. It needs 228 votes to pass, and it's going to get somewhere in the ballpark of 320. The left committed to voting for it a while ago, and members of the Parti Socialiste, which is the most right-wing member of the New Popular Front, also agreed to voting for it, although there are 2 or 3 straggler dissidents who've said that they don't really like the idea. So the whole of the left is behind it, and the far right have now committed to it because although they were basically propping up the Macron government and there were kind of all these sort of shady backroom deals that got Michel Barnier in place, they were not able to spend that long holding him up, because if you get into bed with Macron for too long, voters will start associating you with him, and he is probably the most hated man in France at the moment.
Yeah, so that is what's changed, right? Because in the elections earlier this year, the New Popular Front come out first, the National Rally come second, and then sort of the deal that Macron manages to make is to say, I'll put forward the centre-right politician who's not from my party but got, not that many votes. And the National Rally, so the far right, had said, we will tolerate this. What changed? Why did the National Rally sort of withdraw their support from Michel Barnier?
This was inevitable. They couldn't be seen to be backing Macron forever, as I said. He is toxic politically, and lots of their voters are kind of anti-system voters, and Macron is the most obvious incarnation of the system that they hate. But also the budget that they put forward is extremely harsh in terms of the austerity. As you mentioned, 40 billion euros worth of cuts. That included the cancellation of 4,000 teaching posts, cuts to healthcare spending in an already strained health system. And Marine Le Pen, she plays with this. She alternates between a kind of right-wing economics and more neoliberal economics and a sort of welfare protectionist economics. But she does need to kind of give some sense that she stands for social protections, at least for what she would call indigenous French people. And this budget is basically too harsh for her to do this, and she's to accept. And she's kind of decided that this is the politically opportune moment to collapse it. She first got a series of concessions out of Barnier. Initially, it was removing the tax on the price of electricity. Then it was cancelling the cancellation of medical reimbursements, meaning people could still claim back the price of their medicine. And then it was getting him to agree to indexing pensions to inflation in January rather than July. But the budget still remains very harsh. And she's kind of played this game of getting as much out of him as she can, and then holding her hands up and going, oh, this is still too much, and agreeing to collapse the government. It's also not obvious how this could have carried on beyond this budget, because no one has a majority, and the margins for a majority are really, really hard to reach when there are 3 blocks. So she may be joining the left in trying to push for a presidential election.
As far as I understand, the reason this austerity budget was sort of always sort of coming down the line is because of EU rules, right? So Macron sort of has to tell the European Commission that he is reducing French debt or something along those lines. And so that's why there was always going to be this big showdown. I know that some people were saying that's why he called these snap parliamentary elections in the first place earlier this year. Is that your understanding?
Yes and no. So the EU spending rules do come into play because France kind of breaks them. But the thing is, it has been breaking them for a while. So it could potentially have sought some agreement and continued neglecting them and putting them aside for a bit longer. What has kind of first and foremost happened here is the failure of Macronomics. So one of the speculations as to why he called the election, yes, relates to the EU spending rules, but also actually relates to the size of the deficit. So the deficit was 2.6% when Macron came into power in 2017. By this time, or by the summer, it was anticipated to be 4.4%. In actuality, when the Court of Auditors got to open the books, it was at 6.1%, so much higher than anticipated. And some people, including members of Macron's own party and his own coalition, such as Edouard Philippe, his former prime minister, have accused him of hiding the scale of the deficit alongside his former finance minister, Bruno Le Maire, from the French people. And maybe that's why he called the election, because it wouldn't have been favorable to fight the election on those when it was well known that he had mishandled the economy in this way. Then, yes, the EU kind of deficit rules and spending rules do come in because France is in breach of them. So they need to find some way of rebalancing the budget in order to get within those rules again. For the left, that's a Keynesian relaunch of the economy and higher taxes on the wealthy and on big business. For the right, it is a program of pretty brutal austerity. And the beneficiaries of Macronomics, although I say it has failed in its kind of stated aims, but it has made the wealthy even wealthier. France's top 5 fortunes doubled during COVID. And some people are doing very well out of the Macron settlement. Others are doing less well.
And I can just see that Michel Barnier is currently speaking. So I imagine that means that a vote will be coming soon. But let's talk about sort of strategy here and what comes next. So let's put ourselves in the position of the New Popular Front, which I think is sort of the party that most of our audience will identify with. They are planning to bring down this government. Presumably they're not going to come to an agreement with the National Rally when it comes to sort of an alternative prime minister. Are they going to try and say, we've brought down this prime minister, Macron, you need to come and speak to us again and let one of our number become prime minister? I mean, what's the thinking here? What's the strategy of the various sides?
So it's not just a question of the strategy of the various sides, it's a question of the strategy of the various factions within the New Popular Front. La France Insoumise's line, which is the most left-wing party in the alliance, led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, is that it has to be Lucie Castex, no one else except Lucie Castex. Lucie Castex is the candidate that the New Popular Front agreed on for Prime Minister in the summer. And the goal is either Macron is forced to accept her and some kind of no censure, no confidence deal is agreed and they govern through her. This is incredibly unlikely and they know this. And so in attempting to force her on the government accepting nothing else, they are attempting to make Macron quit and call a presidential election. At least La France Insoumise is. The Socialist Party, on the other hand, has a slightly different line. There is a right-wing faction in the Socialist Party that is determined to open up the New Popular Front to an agreement with the Macronists and reconstitute a kind of left Macronist coalition. The leader of the Socialist Party is not quite on that line, but he is more amenable to that way of thinking, trying to find some kind of governing coalition with the Macronists, getting the Macronists to lend them votes to pass kind of consensual bills. The ecologists also kind of sit in between. They are still promoting Lucie Castex for the moment, but they are also drawing up 12 or 10 or so propositions that they think can find a majority in the assembly and would govern on a text-by-text basis if they've got their way.
And I imagine both sides here. So it seems like unless some sort of deal can be made, we could be looking at new presidential elections. Actually, first of all, how would we get to new presidential elections? Let's take a step back here, right? Because there was one quite recently. Would Macron have to sort of say, I give up, let's have new presidential elections? Is that what happens?
Yeah, so he would have to quit. And you might think, well, why would he ever do that? Why would he immolate his own political project in that way? The one advantage in this for him, which makes it an unlikely possibility, but a serious one to take into account, is that under the French Constitution, we've all had to learn loads about the French Constitution this year. Under the French Constitution, if your presidential term is interrupted, you can run again for a third term. So we could get Macron term 3, theoretically. And there was some speculation that he was going to try this earlier this year. It gets leaked in the press periodically. It gets floated. It gets sort of rown back on, but that is why it must be taken into account. And the goal of La France Insoumise is to provoke a political crisis such that this is basically the only option. And there are factions and parts of the far right that sort of still adopt the more populist, disruptor, agitatory role that also want this. Sébastien Chenu, who is quite senior in Le Rassemblement National, I can't remember exactly what his sort of brief is, but he's a key ally of Le Pen. He's come out recently in Le Figaro pushing this line as well, that there has to be a presidential election. So both sides are trying to pincer in on Macron and make that the kind of only possible conclusion, basically.
And if there were a presidential election, I've just typed in odds for next French president. Marine Le Pen is in second with 5-2. Up first is a guy called Edouard Philippe from Horizons at 7-4. These are odds, by the way, not polls. Who's Edouard Philippe?
Edouard Philippe is Macron's former prime minister. He's the only one of Macron's prime ministers who has served above the average length of a prime ministerial term. Barnier will be the shortest. Gabriel Attal is the third shortest. And then his other two, Elisabeth Borne and Jean Castex, also serve pretty short terms because Macron likes getting rid of them. Edouard Philippe is probably the only member of the Macron coalition with anything resembling charisma. And he has been distancing himself from Macron and Macronism, coming out in public with more attacks on him, saying he's going too far, and trying to build a power base alternative to that of En Marche, Renaissance, in order for him to launch a presidential run. I actually think he declared himself a candidate for 2027, like maybe a week ago. So he is the inheritor of the Macron bloc.
And the other alternative, so am I getting from you that if this passes, if this vote of no confidence passes, a presidential election is actually the most likely, an early presidential election is the most likely?
I don't think it's the most likely, but it's the one option that would resolve the crisis.
So what's more likely? What's a more likely option?
A more likely option is that Macron names a new prime minister. Either he names another right-wing prime minister. Some possibilities include Bruno Retailleau, his hard-right interior minister, or François Bayrou, who leads another one of the mini parties in Macron's coalition. And then they try again. An option that would be constitutionally legitimate is that he just names Barnier again. I mean, he would face immediately the same problems that he faces now, but it's not impossible that he does it. Another option is that he does this. Maybe he tries to name a prime minister of the centre left, a figure like Bernard Cazeneuve, or someone in the Parti Socialiste who is not allied with the leader, who could try and kind of fragment the left's coalition a bit. He sort of tried to do this in the summer. That might become a more serious proposition now. Or he just holds on for a bit. During the summer, France went 51 days without a government. All of the ministers and the prime minister were prime minister and ministers démissionnaires, and meaning that they were resigned and acting in post. And they prepared this austerity budget largely during that time. So he may attempt that again.
And is there a sort of street element to this? I mean, what's the atmosphere in France? Is there sort of revolutionary fervor going on, or is everyone sort of a bit like, God, what the hell is going? Is it a bit? It sort of reminds me a bit of, when you had all those Brexit votes and all the political sort of journalists are sort of, this is the most excited I've ever been, and everyone else is like, what the fuck is going on? I mean, how would you sort of characterize how this process is being absorbed in French society?
With fatigue for the moment. There is a strike planned for tomorrow, and that may stoke things up. There are other sort of sectors of industrial action that are occurring kind of separately to this, but which will try and boost themselves via this. So at the moment, I would say it's fatigue. It's not everyone out on the street. It's not the kind of Gilets jaunes again or the pension reform again, but it could easily become so. People really do hate Macron, and they are very, very frustrated with the kind of lack of democracy at the heart of the Macron project, because he governs in such a way. People call it neo-Bonapartism, basically. Bonapartism was the form of authoritarian kind of right-wing rule that wasn't fascist. And he's like a Bonapartist. He governs by decree, but he doesn't even do what Bonaparte did and kind of placate some of the popular classes. So, like France is kind of always a tinderbox. And it's possible that he could say something, or one of these 49.3 votes where they push through something that's unpopular by decree could set people off again. I wouldn't be surprised.
Ollie Haynes, thank you so much for joining us this evening and updating us on this kind of crazy situation going on in Paris at the moment. We will, of course, be keeping you updated throughout the show when that vote does come in. For now, though, let's go to our next story. Guardian and Observer journalists are currently on a 48-hour strike, their first in 50 years. The industrial action has been prompted by the proposed sale of the Observer newspaper to Tortoise Media. The Observer and the Guardian are currently owned by the Scott Trust, and the Scott Trust wants to keep the Guardian but get rid of the Observer. Journalist Carol Cadwallader was on the picket line this morning explaining her concerns about the sale to Sky News.
It's being sold off in secrecy to a small, financially struggling startup which simply does not have the cash reserves or the management to sustain what should be a well-funded, well-resourced news organisation. And the thing is that the Guardian, the company which owns the Guardian, the Scott Trust, is a billionaire. It's sitting on £1.3 billion in its trust fund. It makes millions on that every year. It has the money to properly invest in us, to figure out the path to a strong, robust digital future. And we just do not understand why this is being rushed through in secrecy without contemplating any other options.
For more details on that strike, I spoke earlier to Novara Media's Labour movement correspondent, Polly Smythe.
The strike is fundamentally about two things. Firstly, it's about the job security of staff at the Observer. So there's 70 staff who are going to be impacted. And whilst the Scott Trust and Tortoise, are saying that they are going to guarantee conditions for staff, staff looking at the Tortoise, a loss-making digital startup that's made a loss of 16 million pounds, since it was started, and saying, I'm not quite convinced, and they can say all they want about contracts, but actually, if the future of the deal is such that the product goes on to be unsuccessful, it's very difficult to guarantee safety of your job and conditions under those terms. And the second thing is also about readership. Fundamentally, the plans for the Observer that Tortoise has is to paywall it and then to make money from subscriptions. Now, there's a real sense that what the Observer offers in the current media landscape is really important, and that it will be a real loss if that is put behind a paywall.
I know Tortoise have said that both Tortoise and the Scott Trust have said that these jobs will go over, these jobs will continue even if they buy it. But putting my head into sort of the mind of, a media entrepreneur who's just bought a paper, which presumably the Observer is loss-making as well, I would imagine. Surely they have to be planning a big restructure if they buy the thing. They aren't going to just buy the thing and say, we're just going to own the Observer and it's going to stay the same. They're going to want to radically change the product, presumably, to try and make it more successful. Is that not the case?
That's part of the concern. The issue is that the Observer doesn't really exist as a discrete entity. I'm sure that if you go on the Guardian website, many people wouldn't even really have much of a perception that there's a distinction between the two things. The Observer content sits on the Guardian website, and unless you're observant, you might not even spot that you're reading an Observer piece. And people tend to think of the Observer as its particularly high-profile columnists, rather than the news and all the other functions that the Observer plays. And the Guardian and the Observer actually share substantial resources. They share a sports desk, they share some foreign reporting, but also on a practical level, they share things like sub-editors, they share things, like an HR department. And so there's a sense of alarm from Observer staff in the fact that those costs haven't been factored in as well. So it's not just, it's not just specifically about whether or not, about job security, but it's also about what kind of content, what kind of product is the Observer going to be. And I think that the sense that I'm getting from the journalists I'm speaking to is that they just haven't seen plans from Tortoise that set out anything realistic in terms of the future for the product that makes them think that there's longevity. And the Observer is the oldest Sunday newspaper in the world. It's got an incredibly rich and long history, and to take that and put it into the hands of a loss-making digital startup that people think actually also the Observer has substantially different politics from it. There's a concern not only about job security, but who are the Tortoise? In 2022, when the Guardian dropped any advertising money from fossil fuels, Tortoise back then were partnering with BP to do, they were called talk-ins, where Tortoise would go to a university campus and would run events, about whose responsibility is it to tackle climate change. We ask our panelists, BP employees. Back in 2010, when James Harding, the Tortoise founder, was the head of the Times, editor-in-chief of the Times, he wrote an editorial saying that, praising David Cameron. And so there's also concerns about what kind of direction that the Observer might go under if the deal was to go ahead.
And I mean, how successful has the strike been? I know there's, I saw a picket line this morning. But if I go on the Guardian website and refresh the page, I can see articles from 8 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, 37 minutes ago. You wouldn't be able to tell by looking at the Guardian website that there is a strike going on. What should we make of that?
So one of the things you will notice if you click on the Guardian website is that there's no bylines at the moment. And so there's no way of knowing who has written an article. And they've done so because they don't want, they want to make the conditions as easy as possible. If people are working today, that their colleagues won't, be pissed off for them scabbing. But a lot of the content will also be being provided by press association agencies. So there's that. But the question you ask raises a really important point, which is how much power do workers have to affect the deal? Can they stop it? The Scott Trust and the Guardian Media Group seem to have been spectacularly unmoved by the threat of strike action. There have been some small concessions given, saying the Scott Trust will play a role in preserving the future of the Observer, even if the sale goes through. But the threat of strike action and 48 hours of strike action as well, which is significant, wasn't enough to stop the deal. There's also other kinds of pressure. It's been a really high-profile dispute. There's lots of interest from all sorts of kinds of people. I believe Sienna Miller has come out and said she opposes the deal, but also 6 former editors of The Observer and The Guardian, including Alan Rusbridger, have said that they oppose the deal. So there's a lot of pressure and a lot of scrutiny. And I think also the other thing that's interesting about the dispute is that it might have begun about the sale of The Observer, but it's actually now becoming about the direction that The Guardian is going in general, in confidence in Kath Viner, the editor-in-chief, whether or not The Guardian still puts journalism ahead of business. There's lots of different factors now that are being brought into the dispute.
That was Polly Smythe speaking to me earlier today. Helena, I want your views on this. I can see a fair number of people in the comments who don't seem too quick to jump to the defense of the Observer and don't sound like they would necessarily miss the newspaper. That's not to say they're not in solidarity with people on strike, but I mean, what's your take on this?
Well, that's certainly a position I share. I have once, I think I once said on Twitter at one point, I'm looking forward to the Guardian and the Observer being consigned to the dustbin of history. But regardless of my personal opinions from the kind of content that the Guardian and the Observer produce, I mean, I dislike them to the point at which I have my Guardian. When I log into the Guardian online, I have it deliberately set to the Australian version, because actually the Australian and the US versions of the Guardian wrote open letters critiquing, for example, the level of transphobia in the UK Guardian. Like, that's the level to which that I'm trying to personally not interact with the Guardian and the Observer's journalism. But regardless, whatever you personally think about the Observer as an entity, about the journalism that it puts out, about the people who work there, which I think is a lot of people's criticism, is the opinions of the people who do the journalism, rather than the existence of a kind of a broad-based liberal to left-wing paper that carries different opinions regardless of where they come from. At the end of the day, I will always show solidarity with striking workers, regardless of that. I mean, I don't not support striking workers at other places based on their political opinions. And at the end of the day, it should be the rights of all workers, regardless of where they work, to have a say over the workplace they work in. That's a basic fundamental principle I hold as a socialist, and I'm not going to change that just because I think that there are some incredibly unsavory individuals who do journalism for the Observer very specifically, no names mentioned. The thing, of course, is that whilst we all personally have all of these stories about how we dislike certain journalists who work there and their opinions, and as was pointed out by Polly earlier in the piece we just listened to, it's not just the mainstream people at the forefront, like the actual kind of the talent, the mainstream figures at the Observer who are going to be affected by this. There are people who work at every single level within the Observer as an entity who will be potentially affected by this, and they're just normal workers doing their normal jobs to be able to contribute to something. And that is the people, those are the regular people at the paper who I will show the most solidarity with, regardless. And at the end of the day, this is fundamentally about, do we show support for striking workers or not? And I think that we have to, whether or not it's people striking over the sale of the Observer, or all of the NEU picketers on today or any NEU strikers on the picket lines today in support of sixth form teachers who are striking. That was announced today as well. What I will say, though, there is a lot of hypocrisy going on this one. I did see that there were multiple Labour MPs on the picket line for the Observer, and not just left-wing ones. There were plenty there who were people who are friendly with the current leadership of the Labour Party, like Paul Waugh was on the picket line that I saw there. Interesting that they're now allowed to go on picket lines. I thought it was a party of power and not protest. Well, that lasted a very long time when it's the liberal newspaper of record, rather than, say, striking nurses and junior doctors, for example. And indeed, there is hypocrisy from some journalists at the Observer as well. So, for example, there was a bit in the Observer in 2016 by Sonia Soda about how it's time for the BMA to stop striking for junior doctors. And well, okay, maybe if you're not going to show solidarity to your fellow workers, maybe you shouldn't expect it back. I mean, the biggest part about all of this is that one of the main criticisms a lot of people on the left have about the Guardian and the Observer is how critical they were of the Labour leadership under Jeremy Corbyn. Right, that's a lot of where our support within the kind of Novara media support sphere kind of coalesces around the Corbyn project of that era. And one of the policies in the 2017 manifesto was the right to own, which is that if where you work gets sold off, the workers would be the buyers of first refusal who would be able to intervene to buy out that entity, rather than it being sold off to whatever parent company it might be, whether it's a private equity firm or indeed some loss-making entertainment media business elsewhere who you have fundamental disagreements with. And if we did have, miraculously in 2017, a Labour government, if they'd have properly supported the Corbyn project at that point, they might not be in this position, and they might have been able to buy out the paper instead of getting sold off to tortoise. And unfortunately, they don't have that position now. But regardless of all of this, I will always show them my solidarity if they go on strike.
I thought you bringing up the banner going on picket lines made me giggle a bit. Just imagining sort of like the most Keir Starmer policy I can imagine, where you're banned from going on picket lines with this sort of really important carve out for newspaper columnists who are one sort of class of workers who we will really make an exception for. That's okay. That's okay. If you're going out to support them, go for it. One outfit that will never be up for sale, we're not going to get sold to tortoise, is Novara Media. And that means we need you guys.
2024 saw a lot. From decisive election results on both sides of the Atlantic.
Look what happened. Is this crazy?
To an ongoing genocide in Gaza and an emerging radical right.
So I'm coming back.
In both politics and culture.
We've seen the lengths the establishment is prepared to go to control the narrative.
Do you condemn?
Condemn.
What
Hamas did on October the 7th.
But thanks to our supporters, we've helped to correct the record.
Journalists don't understand that they're part of a propaganda system.
The level of bias hasn't changed.
What I pick up all the time is the frustration of voices not heard.
The media doesn't just need to be top down, where billionaires either decide the truth or ignore it.
Novara Media exists because of our supporters.
We are truly people-powered because the average supporter gives us £8 a month.
This allows us to cover stories across video,
I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to you. Clear up.
articles, and podcasts in a truly unique way.
Thank you to Novara Media for existing.
We've given a platform to the voices hit hardest by brutal policies.
Well, with all the shops being closed down.
The people and the communities the mainstream media ignores.
I am struggling, really struggling.
And the powerful try to silence.
We've broken stories into the mainstream.
I'm not aware of these allegations, but they sound very concerning.
Followed election campaign.
Beautiful Gattleming.
And covered election nights both in the UK and elsewhere.
Up and down, left and right. MAGA!
At Novara Media, we are up against powerful vested interests.
But with your support, we'll continue to tackle it head-on in ways you just won't find anywhere else.
And people-powered media needs people to power it.
That's why we're asking for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage per month.
Because a different kind of politics needs a different kind of media.
Donate today at novaramedia.com/support.
We're ready. Are you?
Once again, if you're already donating to us, thank you so much. We really do appreciate it. If you're not, it would mean so much to us, so much, if you consider signing up for the equivalent of 1 hour's wage a month. It's what keeps us going. We've got lots of big plans for the new year. Personally, I want to get a nice new shiny studio. But there's so many projects at Novara Media going on at the moment. And we really do want your support. And you can go to novaramedia.com/support. You could even sign up for someone else for Christmas. I don't know if we have some sort of system whereby you can do that formally, but it sounds like it would make sense, doesn't it? You can just show them the email, show them the confirmation email, and that will be the gift. Put it in a card. Again, if you're already a subscriber, thank you so much. You make this all possible. If not, please do go to novaramedia.com/support. South Korean MPs have begun impeachment proceedings against the country's president, Yoon Suk-yeol. A reminder that if you launch a last-ditch coup, you better be successful. Now, as you'll probably know by now, the failed coup started with a late-night broadcast from the president. That was with Yoon declaring martial law, apparently to save the Republic of Korea from North Korean communist forces, who he said were colluding with opposition parties at home. Troops were then seen arriving at South Korea's parliament to enforce that decree, where they appear to have sort of smashed into the building via the windows. But parliamentary aides inside and outside the building resisted the troops, allowing lawmakers time to assemble and vote down Yoon's martial law decree. Meanwhile, thousands of ordinary Koreans gathered outside Parliament to protest the president. They clashed with soldiers too and tried to occupy the building. In total, the botched coup was all over within 2 hours and 28 minutes. It's a fairly short coup by historical standards, and at around 4:30 a.m. Korean time, in another televised address, or an update, Yoon accepted defeat, saying after the National Assembly's demand to lift martial law, he's just sitting down here, isn't he? But when he starts speaking, he will be saying this, I will accept the National Assembly's demand and lift martial law through a cabinet meeting. However, I asked the National Assembly to immediately stop the reckless activities of paralysing the function of the country through repeated impeachment attempts, manipulation of legislation and budget. I'm not sure Yoon is the right guy to be calling other people reckless after his 2.5-hour coup. And this morning, the floor leader of the opposition Democratic Party said this.
Even if martial law is lifted, he cannot avoid treason charges. It was clearly revealed to the entire nation that President Yoon could no longer run the country normally. He should step down, resign immediately. This is the mandate of the people.
That threat of treason charges is a pretty big one, with the crime carrying a maximum sentence of the death penalty in South Korea. But Yoon appears reluctant to resign, and 6 South Korean opposition parties have now submitted a bill calling for President Yoon's impeachment. That would require the assent of 2/3 of the country's parliament, which would mean at least 8 of Yoon's own party representatives would have to support it. That vote could take place as soon as Friday. And in a bad sign for the president, Yoon's party already seems to be turning on him, with his chief of staff and a dozen senior secretaries to the president having quit. And the party has also called for the removal of its own defense minister, who allegedly recommended martial law to the president. If the impeachment bill passes in parliament, it will go to the country's constitutional court. In the meantime, South Korea's biggest trade union has said its members will now go on an indefinite general strike until the president stands down. And thousands of South Koreans have been demonstrating today, including holding candlelight vigils outside the National Assembly to protest Yoon's attempted coup. To find out more about these extraordinary developments, I spoke earlier to Jamie Doucette, a human geographer at the University of Manchester and author of the book, The Post-Developmental State: Dilemmas of Economic Democratization in Contemporary South Korea. I began by asking him whether 24 hours on were any clearer as to why President Yoon made his reckless decision.
I don't think we have the definitive answer yet, but we know a little bit more about it. You know, that it was suggested by his Minister of National Defense, which is an old friend from middle school. He'd stacked a lot of the military and defense agencies with his friends from Chungnam Middle School. We know that it was a reckless and desperate move. As to what he was thinking, that's still something we need to answer.
And I mean, again, I suppose, it's difficult to do alternate histories, but what's the sense that this was sort of a lucky break, I suppose, for the Koreans, and that this could have worked? There could have been a coup. They could still be under a military rule now. Or do you think this was always bound to fail and was a bit of a madcap plan, sort of evidently, I suppose, in terms of what happened over the following hours?
Yeah, I mean, almost instantly. I mean, you don't want to be shrill about these things when they're in process. You know, I think I said to someone, it was a bit like Liz Truss announcing a coup to stay in power, in the sense that Yoon is someone who does not have a lot of organic support at the moment. He's rallying with everyone, including his own protege, who's now party leader, and who he also tried to arrest through this maneuver. Friends in Korea were saying, 3 days at the most. It was 3 hours. So yeah, it seemed, you could tell pretty quickly. I was nervous. History doesn't repeat itself twice. And as you know, Korea had this huge civilian uprising in 2016, 2017. It was largely peaceful, the Candlelight Revolution. This was a much more aggressive move by the government, right? Park Geun-hye, even though she was the dictator's daughter, she didn't declare martial law in this way, although plans were driven up. So, he was kind of leading in a very aggressive way. So I myself was fearing that there could be violence, but at least it didn't turn out that way.
And Yoon's justification for martial law, so in sort of that video clip that's now been played around the world, he was saying the reason this was necessary is because there are left-wing opposition progressive parties in South Korea who are colluding with the North Koreans. I mean, is there anything to that? What was he referring to then?
Yeah, what was he on? I mean, this is kind of tired old phrases of the anti-communist left, but yet it is something that is bandied about, this idea of kind of slavish pro-North forces, right, that infiltrated the democracy movement, our human rights movement. He says this, and that's why I think people didn't pay attention, because conservative governments always say that. In the US, you have this rhetoric, right, where like Biden's a communist. This is kind of the Korean version of that. It doesn't mean that there isn't the odd left nationalist out. And during the Park Geun-hye administration, for instance, she dissolved a left nationalist political party that did have a kind of rosy view, if you will, of North Korea. But that was a constitutional case, right? but this is just him going after the liberal democratic opposition and even his own party head. So, yeah.
And I mean, the coup has failed. There's now an attempt to impeach President Yoon. Is that likely to be successful?
I think so. So the question is, does he resign before impeachment? There'll be a vote on impeachment in the next little while, in a matter of days. And then he will be impeached, and then it will have to be confirmed by the Constitutional Court, and that can take a while. I guess the question is whether or not there's a majority for it. Like, pro-democratic forces have about 190 of the 300 seats. They need over 200. Given that 18 members of the Conservative Party voted to rescind martial law, I think they'll get it. So, I mean, I can't see him surviving. Even the arch conservative media have called this suicidal. So, yeah.
And what does this tell us about South Korea? I mean, it's been repeated a bunch of times over the past 24 hours, so it might seem somewhat trite. But I mean, when we think of South Korea, we think of a very sort of economically advanced country, a stable, successful, liberal democracy. Is the events of yesterday something which should challenge that notion, or the fact that this coup sort of failed so quickly? Is it actually a sign of institutional strength in South Korea?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of both. I think the memory of democratization is so recent, right? I mean, people fought and struggled for this, and they're still fighting and struggling for this. So we've had, the democracy movements of the 70s and 80s, which really continue on into the 90s. We have these big events like the Candlelight Revolution. This is the latest event in those lines where people have taken to the streets. So I think that in ways informs a kind of popular practice and popular memory of democratization. I mean, there's some institutional features in that. Technically, it seems like his declaration of martial law was illegal, but that he didn't actually have the power to do that. There's some legal debate about how lawful this was. So that is, the result of constitutional and legal revision. So there's some formal and informal strengths here. Korean democracy, is it stable? It is, but there's certainly attempts to subvert it. I mean, Park Geun-hye tried to act like it was the 1970s with all these sort of informal things like the blacklist. There are some threats. There's still very coercive restrictions on freedom of association that affect labor in particular. So it's not always the greatest place. It's got rapid development, but there's a human cost to that development, which is, manifested in inequality, highest numbers of non-standard or irregular workers in the OECD, some of the worst gender equality. So we got to sort of assess it from a more that kind of standpoint, right? Who is it good for? Who suffered?
Well, I mean, I suppose one thing it's clearly not good for is families, to the extent that no one's really having kids at the moment in South Korea. I suppose I want to move on to a somewhat different topic. What does this mean for the military, right? When you have a president going a bit rogue and saying, I'm instituting martial law, you're saying that now people are saying this was illegal. The military did go along with it, ended up sort of fighting with lawmakers and their advisors. What could this mean for the South Korean military now? Is there going to be sort of a bit of a reckoning within that institution?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, in the last 3 or 4 months, Yoon has appointed his high school buddies to a number of these positions. So that's kind of a new change. And I don't think those people maybe have that kind of organic ability to bring the whole military along with them, right? It's a certain detachments of special forces. I don't know if it's correct, but some people said they only had blanks. You could see that they were kind of cowering, as people were confronting them. So I think they had maybe a clear sense that if they did something, there would be consequences. So there is that question of what this means for the military. But I think more so the more important question is what it means for the prosecutorial apparatus. So Yoon comes from the prosecution service. He was Moon's prosecutor general. He's the one who prosecuted impeached President Park Geun-hye, the former conservative president, Sam Chae-bol. He was seen as this kind of fair-minded prosecutor, unbeholden to no one. But he objected to Moon Jae-in, the pro-democratic liberal president before him, his attempt to kind of bracket and control some of the power of the prosecution. Prosecutors in Korea have enormous power over arrest and indictment, and they frequently collude, right? So they need to have their power restructured. He fought that restructuring. Some of it came through, but what it did is it sort of empowered his faction of prosecutors, and he's been kind of using them to harass the left ever since. So I think for those people, I don't know how well ensconced in the military those people are, but the other sort of public security agencies, I think that's the place to kind of look at too, going forward.
And there were a couple of moments on the news last night when this was all sort of a developing story where sort of people were suggesting, maybe North Korea will now sense an opportunity because their neighbor are in chaos. Was that a bit of a hysterical reaction, or is there something to that?
I mean, that might have been something in the international news, but I didn't really see that so much domestic.
The Turner Prize, which is the UK's most prestigious art award, was won this week by Scottish artist Jasleen Kaur. The 38-year-old artist won the prize for her show at Glasgow's contemporary arts venue Tramway, which included a vintage car covered with a giant doily, alongside worship bells and iron brew to celebrate the Scottish Sikh community. The judges praised the considered way in which Kaur wove together the personal, political and spiritual in her exhibition, and those themes were also evident in her acceptance speech.
From where I am now, I want to echo the calls of the protesters outside. A protest made up of artists, culture workers, Tate staff, students who I stand firmly with. They've gathered to make visible the demands of the open letter signed by, when I last checked, 1,310 signatories in just a week, calling for you, Tate, to sever ties with organisations complicit in what the UN and the ICJ are finally getting closer to saying is a genocide of the Palestinian people. This is not a radical demand. This should not risk an artist's career or safety. We're trying to build consensus that the ties to these organisations are unethical, just as artists did with Sackler. I've been wondering why artists are required to dream up liberation in the gallery, but when that dream meets life, we are shut down. I want the separation between the expression of politics in the gallery and the practice of politics in life to disappear. I want the institution to understand that if you want us inside, you need to listen to us outside. We needed a ceasefire a very long time ago. We need a proper ceasefire now. Arms embargo now. Free Palestine.
A powerful speech, and Kaur wasn't the only artist to have used an acceptance speech to speak up for Palestine in the last few days, when Sally Rooney accepted the prize for Best Novelist at the Irish Book Awards last week. She spoke about Palestine. And when a member of the Irish rock band Fontaines DC accepted the Best Album Award from Rolling Stone magazine, he said this.
I don't know. I just think there's only a couple of words to say here. It's kind of weird. It's the first time it's said all night, but I'm just going to say, Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Free Palestine. Fuck Netanyahu and fuck Zionism. Free Palestine.
So the Fontaines DC guy was especially strong. I mean, it's saying F Zionism at a sort of prestigious awards ceremony. That's quite brave, I think, actually. Helena, what did you make of those? And I suppose, do you think this stuff matters?
Well, yes and no, in a way. So, first of all, any voice being added to the chorus of voices calling for Palestinian liberation, they're all needed and they are all good. It's always good to expand the amount of people who are calling for ceasefires, calling for arms embargoes, who are expressing solidarity with the Palestinian cause. And I will always welcome people who have platforms to use their platforms to speak up for this, obviously this incredibly important issue that is never going to go away when it hasn't gone away for the last 50 years at the very least, right? This is something that is clearly important. I really liked Juliet Stevenson using some time to talk about Palestine very, very recently, a very, very powerful speech that she gave as well. But I would have a word of caution with what we're seeing, and that is that one thing that seems to have permeated political culture quite a lot very recently is that there just seemed to be a kind of pushback against this idea of activist celebrities, right? So people who otherwise don't have many other concerns because they're in pretty privileged positions, talking about issues that they care about. I personally, obviously, I'm not a cynic. I think they genuinely care about these issues. But there is an issue that we have, there's a problem with outwardly looking to people who would otherwise be brought into the cause that we all support, perceiving it to be only the preserve of activist celebrity types, as these are the kind of people who we see having a position to speak about these things. Now, we look at the polling, we all see that within the UK broadly, there is a consensus in supporting the Palestinians, in opposing people like Netanyahu and wanting things like arms embargoes and political sanctions and boycotts. Loads of different things see broad support in the country. But if we get to the point where people are only seeing those who are talking about this through the lens of like celebrities talking about it or cultural figures endorsing these things and using their platforms to speak about it, that can have a negative effect on people's perceptions of the campaign and thinking of it as being a part of the elites, right? Elites who don't have any other concerns, so they have a time to be activists over these sorts of things. This is, for example, I'm not saying that these are the same thing, because obviously these are on opposite ends of the political spectrum, specifically on this issue. This is a kind of thing that hurt the Kamala Harris campaign in America. Again, these people are obviously in opposition. These people, the people who caused genocide in the first place, right? But well, I guess they ones who supported it throughout the entirety of the time that's been happening through arms sales. But regardless, there was the perception about the campaign that was being ran that it didn't speak to normal people's concerns, because there were loads of celebrities endorsing, loads of celebrities got on the campaign trail to say, you have to support this because of XYZ issue that, it's outside people's material concerns. And that put people off. That didn't get popular support. Remember, there's always been this kind of undercurrent, especially in UK politics, of actually not liking celebrities, not liking kind of relevant cultural figures and seeing them as being aloof and elitist. And so having something as incredibly important as the campaign for Palestinian liberation and the effort to support Palestinian liberation, it has to be broad-based. It has to be through the lens of ordinary people in this country. And whilst I think that those voices are necessary and needed, they can't be the face of the campaigning. And the more we see it over and over and over again, just like people at fancy awards ceremonies talking about Palestine, the less that I think it will tap into the fact that this should be something that everyone in this country, and everyone in this country does broadly support, which is a breaking of support between the UK and Israel. So I have mixed opinions on this.
Yeah, so I suppose where I see where you're coming from. I think it's a smart point. I think maybe where I think there's a big difference between the Harris campaign and what we're seeing here is the Harris campaign was using celebrities to try and appeal to a mass audience, to try and appeal to the median voter. And I think people did sort of look up and say, look, I don't really relate to Beyonce. I don't really relate to Taylor Swift or whoever. I mean, maybe some people did, but clearly not enough people did, because she didn't win. And it did sort of make her campaign seem a bit out of touch, the extent to which she was relying on celebrities. I suppose there's a couple of ways of looking at sort of celebrities speaking about various things. Like for Harris, it was to get people to vote. And it could be, when it comes to sort of cultural figures, it's potentially not so much a platform to speak to the general public, but rather part of a campaign to basically make Israelis uncomfortable in different environments. It's a bit sort of like, if you're looking at like South Africa, where it's sort of the fact that everyone was saying, we don't want to play your sports teams. It wasn't so much that persuaded the general public in this country. It was that it made sports fans in South Africa think, oh, this is now inconveniencing us. And I suppose the fact that music venues, that awards ceremonies, that these sort of quite prestigious places where a Israeli cultural figure might want to feel welcome, no longer sort of feels so welcome there, then that could, I suppose, via that route, put pressure on governments, less so via the electoral route. So it might sort of make more sense as a way of isolating Israel as opposed to winning over new supporters for the Palestinian cause. Does that? Do you see where I'm coming from?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're right. And that's why I say that I think it's good that they do it, but I have some concerns over how that might look to people. Because whilst you and I probably both agree that a lot of these people who are saying these things are doing it 100% sincerely. This is, we look at the genocide that we see, we look at the scenes coming out of Gaza, and we have this instant gut human reaction. I think that a lot of people are going to be a lot more cynical than you or I, and will look at celebrities making these endorsements and going, well, these are just people who are out there that are trying to get woke points. They're trying to look woke by speaking up about this specific issue. I mean, we all seem to be that whenever we see, I don't know, celebrities endorsing children in need and go, well, you people have loads of money, right? Obviously, I know Jocelyn Cow doesn't have loads of money, but you know what I mean when you look at any kind of media individual, when you look at like the Fontaines DC, for example, and say, well, you have money, you could be doing things with regards to children in need, and yet all you're doing is talking about it. Obviously, the difference, of course, the Palestinian cause, this is a political issue. This is a political issue that will require political solutions rather than financial solutions. So using that to put pressure on Israelis and make them feel uncomfortable about what they support, I definitely agree with you that is something that could very much likely come out of this. The only thing I would push back on and say, well, a lot of the times when you have this incredibly ideologically captured population like Israel, I think that they'll probably just look at that and just go, well, it just proves you how institutionally anti-Semitic the world clearly is now for not supporting our genocide. So I don't know, it could go either way.
Helena, thank you so much for joining me this evening. It's always an absolute pleasure being joined by you on the show.
Thank you for having me as always.
And unfortunately, we don't have an update for you on that vote of no confidence because it seems like it's going to happen later in the evening. We'll, of course, be back tomorrow with any and all updates. For now, thank you so much for watching Novara Media. Good night.